All right, I'm gonna admit everybody in. That's in right now. I'm gonna hit the go live button. Okay, it's giving me an error for the go live thing. I don't know why. Try doing it again. That didn't work. All right. Try one more time. Okay, guys. It says it's live streaming, so let's see how it goes. All right, guys. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here with introductions. As people come in, I'll go ahead and let them in. Just to, my name is, hold on, let me switch to speaker form. All right. So my name is Christopher Carmona, and I am going to be moderating today's panel. Today we're going to be starting as, well, this will be the second one of the History Has Eyes on You series, which we're going to have a series of talks, particularly once a month. And today we're going to be discussing the mascots situation, mascots, the monuments, and postcards, and really kind of the visual rhetoric of violence that has been done in the country so far. We have actually five presenters, but two of them are going to be presenting together. And so I'm going to go ahead and introduce them. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jerry Padilla, who's going to be talking about the Jake Publishing, who's the press. But let me go ahead and introduce the speakers here. So first we have Nati Roman. She is an undergraduate student at San Antonio College who is majoring in Mexican American Studies. She is currently the president of Somos La Gente, which is the Mexican American Studies group that devotes their time to promoting culture, knowledge, and community enrichment through Chicanx, Latinx, and Indigenous empowerment. And she has been instrumental in the removal of the Ranger mascot at San Antonio College. She frequently lectures on campus and universities and colleges about the violent history of the Texas Rangers. And we also have Diana Flores, who is also the founding member of one of the founding members of Somos La Gente. And she is currently working with her research partner, Nati, and presenting on the SAC Ranger mascot situation, which they will talk about their fight. They're going to be the first ones to talk about, what happened with the Texas Ranger mascot situation at San Antonio College. She recently obtained her associates from San Antonio College and is continuing her educational career and wants to pursue a PhD in history. And so after that, we're going to have Trinidad Gonzales, who is a history instructor at South Texas College. He has served at the American Historical Association teaching division counselor from 2014 to 2017, and is a member of the Refusing to Forget project. And his research areas include the Lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas during the early 20th century. Then we have Noreen Rivera, who is an associate professor of literature and cultural studies at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley. Her work covers 19th and 20th century Mexican American Chicanx literature and oral folk culture. Her forthcoming book is a critical edition entitled The Far East Journals and Other Cold War Era Writings of Americo Paredes, which recovers Chicano icon Americo Paredes' autobiographical writings. Give me 1 second. In the context of the global Cold War. Her articles and essays have been published in Aztlán, Journal of Chicano Studies, the Journal of South Texas, Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage, Chicano Latino Studies, and Oxford Bibliographies. And finally, we have Marci MacMahon, who is a professor in the Department of Literature and Cultural Studies at UTRGV. She teaches and writes about Chicanx and Latinx literature and cultural studies, theater and performance, and gender and sexuality. She's the author of Domestic Negotiations, Gender, Nation, and Self-Fashioning in U.S., Mexicana, and Chicano Literature and Art. Her publications appear in the Chicano Studies Reader, Aztlán, a journal of Chicano Studies, Chicana Latina Studies, a journal of Mox, and Frontiers, a journal of women's study. She is currently working on her second book that explores the relationship between vocality and citizenship in U.S. Latinx theater and performance. So I want to go ahead and welcome all of our speakers today. And I'm going to go ahead and right now I'm going to turn it over to the hosts of these talks, which is Gerald Badin. So go ahead and talk about the press. Jerry? There's Jerry.
There it is. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Gerald Badilla. I also go by Jerry. I'm the co-founder of Jade Publishing. Of course, we're extremely happy to help sponsor this event and events such as this. For us, it's really important also to help promote our stories. There's a lot that needs to be retold. There's a lot that has been forgotten. And of course, our job is to make sure that we can connect with what's happened and of course connect with historians and writers around the country so we can create awareness of our stories, our culture. And so at Jade Publishing, we hope to push these narratives. And of course, we felt this event that talks about the rhetoric and the hate and monuments in the US was very important. So for example, in Jade Publishing, and this is kind of to illustrate a little bit what works we do, we help promote, of course, a lot of our indigenous ancestry. So we have, for example, books such as this for youth, Aztectopia, that is comic based. We have a lot of English, Spanish literature, even literature in native languages, right? For example, Noyolcanyolque. This book is in English, Spanish, and Nahuatl. We have other books that are also bilingual. Recently, we've also published books that are in Maya Quiche, right? So these are books written by people from the Mayan community in their languages, also translated to Spanish and some into English also. So we're very proud of the work that we do, because we feel these works definitely address a need, not only here in the US, but across the Americas, right? And of course, we're also very proud of this book right here, which is El Rinche by Christopher Carmona. And we're very proud because this book right here addresses the issue that has been very prevalent throughout this year, right? And this talks about the Texas Rangers. This talks about the Mascots. This talks about, and this, of course, this book was published before this all, kind of exploded. And although the book is fictional history, it talks a lot about the realities of what occurred here in Texas in the early 20th century. So that's some of the stuff that we do at Jade Publishing, just to give you a broad idea of what we do. For anybody interested in looking into more of our works and what we do, you can visit us at jadepublishing.org and check us out. Check out our website. And we're here to stay and to continue helping our community share their stories. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Christopher.
Thank you, Jerry. So thank you all. Just want to go over a bit of the ground rules for this presentation. Most of you, everybody here is muted. So if you have questions for the speakers, you can go ahead and plug them into the chat box as the speakers are talking. And once all four of the presentations are done, we will start to begin to address the questions that you guys might have in the audience. And I do have, as a moderator, some questions that I will ask them after they're done with their presentations as well. But those are just some of the ground rules, just to make sure you keep your mics muted while the presenters are speaking. But yes, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Nati and Diana, and they're going to talk about their fight against the mascot, the Ranger mascot at San Antonio College.
Right, let me share my screen. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Awesome. So I'm going to get started. Thank you so much, Chris, for inviting us to speak today. So we're going to give a little bit of a summary of our campaign to change the ranger. This was a campaign that was led by students, specifically students from Somos La Gente, which is a Mexican-American studies student organization at SAC. This group was started in 2016, and at the time that it was started, all of the founding members were taking Mexican-American studies courses. So one of the things that inevitably happens when we start taking our, these math classes is we start getting more of a complete and accurate picture of Texas history. And we start to re-examine some of the, iconography and things that are celebrated around us. So for example, in San Antonio, we have Fiesta San Antonio and also the Alamo. So another thing that we started to re-examine as we, gained more knowledge about history was the Texas Ranger and our Ranger mascot. So we started learning about the really horrific crimes that the Texas Rangers were responsible for throughout the, the founding of Texas. These crimes committed against Mexicanos, Tejanos, Black and Indigenous communities. And so we very quickly came to the conclusion that this was not an appropriate mascot for us, and that we really needed to do something to remove it. And so we set about doing that. And so the way that we did that can kind of be broken up into 3 steps. So the first was educating ourselves. And like I said, that really began in the mosque classroom and then continued outside of the classroom with our own personal research. Step 2 was educating others. So once we had amassed, some information, we created an informative zine that we would hand out on campus that had, a history and some of our research as a quick and accessible way to teach this to other students. And then step 3 was action. So meeting with the SAC president, talking with our professors, gaining community allies, and speaking to the press, and also petitioning. This is a little bit of the research that we found. So this is the first instance where we see the Ranger mascot at SAC. This is our school newspaper, the Junior Ranger from the year 1926. So up top, you can see a little tiny little rangers with like shooting guns in the air and stuff. This is a picture from 1928 from the yearbook. So not only does the basketball team here have Ranger written on their jersey, this is also in the yearbook that was at the time called the Alamo. So a lot of symbology here. And it becomes very clear who this segregated institution was created by and who it was meant to serve. These are a few of the past depictions that you could find on campus of the Ranger mascot. This is an article from our Ranger newspaper from the year 2000 that talks about the violent history of the Rangers and also some of the controversy and debate about having a Ranger mascot. So finally, in 2014, I believe, SAC decided to get an official mascot image for the Ranger. And this is how it's described on the SAC website. It talks about the previous images looking cruel, harsh, and mean. And so, quote, due to the historical controversy surrounding the Texas Rangers, SAC decided to no longer use a human image to depict the Ranger. And so on the website, they're very clearly acknowledging that they have an understanding of a controversial history. And they attempt to soften the image of the Ranger by adopting this guy, the Gnome Ranger. And so on the bio on the SAC website for the Gnome Ranger, it calls him a vigilante who fights injustice and protects the homestead, which is SAC. And so if we know about Texas Ranger history, we know that the homestead that they were historically protecting was Anglo settlements, right? They weren't protecting any other settlements, and quite often they were actually very violently acquiring land from others. And so our research really showed that SAC has known about the violent history of the Texas Rangers, right, for a long time, and has tried to distance themselves from this history, but without actually taking steps to remove and replace the Ranger mascot. And so that really became our mission, was to get the Ranger mascot completely removed and replace it with something else. And so that brings us into our educational campaign that Diana is going to talk a little bit about.
Thank you, Nati. So, like Nati just said, our campaign was education based. We worked at educating our fellow classmates, the students, faculty, and staff on the problematic nature of the ranger and SAC having the ranger mascot. We printed our zine, which I have linked in the chat, so you guys can flip through digitally. We have here the Gnome Ranger and the violent history of our mascot, included images, links on where to look for more information on historical context. And we really wanted to drive home that this was not an appropriate mascot for the student body or SAC. So we had several meetings with administration, and we truly felt that Dr. Vela and administration was on board with us at changing the mascot. They understood that it was problematic. We were feeling good about getting it changed. And in October, unfortunately, we were blindsided by Antonio, the masked ranger, who we have here. He is he looks like Zorro. He looks like the Lone Ranger. It's pretty ridiculous. He's presumably Latino or Hispanic, which is a slap in the face on everything that we were asking for. And we immediately contacted the press. That's when we got the press involved, and we continued to push. And in response to our opposition, our student government association invited a current Texas Ranger to come and speak on campus. And when Nati and myself posed the question as, what do you feel, how do you feel the violent history of the Texas Rangers affects the job that you do today? He said, quote, if those things took place, then that's what took place, and we can't go back and change it. So he's saying if they took place, there's no two sides of history, there's facts. And he was very dismissive of our questions and what we said about the history of the violent history. So we continued our campaign and continued to make it known that this was not our mascot. It did not represent us. We wanted nothing to do with the Ranger, and we called for students to join our Change the Ranger campaign. One of the other ways that we were reaching out to students was through our faculty. Our faculty was giving lectures on our campaign and the Rangers and the SAC Ranger mascot. This is Professor Caleb Miller, and he was giving a lecture here, and he was sharing our zine, and we went to several universities to go and give lectures on the Rangers and on the problematic nature. So another way that we were contacting or getting out to the community was to conferences. And Nati here, she attended the National Chicano Student Walkout Conference, where she met Mario Compian, Aurelio Montemayor, and Jose Angel Gutierrez, who were civil rights advocates in San Antonio, and they signed our petition, and they let other people know in the community on our campaign and why this was a problem. So 2020 comes along, and we're all sent home because of COVID, and the world and the U.S. saw the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. And we really started having a serious conversation about white supremacy, racism, institutional racism, police brutality. And amongst each other, we talked about how, the Ranger continued to be a symbol of white supremacy and the need to change it. So our professors, Lisa Ramos and the professors at Moss, asked Dr. Vela for a meeting to discuss these. Now, they were also asking for the removal of Confederate statues and white supremacy, and one of them was this Texas Ranger statue that was at the Dallas airport at Love Field, and that was removed. So we asked for a meeting, and in that meeting, we spoke to Dr. Vela to reiterate everything that we had been saying for the last 2 years on the problematic nature, and he finally agreed that it had to be changed. He said that with what was happening in the climate, it could no longer be allowed to be associated with SAC, and he called for a public feedback from the community, from students, faculty, staff, anybody that wanted to really vote. And we were able to vote to keep or to remove the mascot. And at the end, 59 chose to remove it and 41% chose to keep it. Ultimately, the vote would come down to the college council. It was made up of faculty, staff, and administrators, and they would be the ultimate vote to get it removed. We were allowed to speak, us and myself and Nati, our professors, other professors from UTSA, academics and scholars in the field. They came and gave their testimonials on and historical facts about the problematic nature of not only the ranger, but these white supremacist symbols and these statues and everything, institutional racism. So we had an outpour of support from the community, and the College Council voted unanimously to disassociate SAC from the ranger mascot. Finally, after 2 years, after more than almost 100 years, it was finally disassociated from SAC completely. So what now? What comes next for us, for Somos la Gente? Well, we have to come up with a new mascot. We have to, figure it out, continue educating our students so we don't have another racist mascot, another white supremacist mascot. And our campaign, our continuing campaign, will call for a non-human, non-violent, and a non-racist a figure. So that's our next step, holding administration accountable for what they said, that we won't have any racist symbols. So this is what we're doing coming up on in the fall.
Yeah, so also making sure that whatever mascot is chosen by the SAC community, to figuring out an effective way to have involvement with all students and staff and faculty in the SAC community, so it can be chosen collaboratively. And so then we'll just end off by saying, thank you to everybody who participated in this campaign. We had so many people supporting us, our professors in the Mass department, who always had our back, Dr. Ramos, Dr. Bueno, Professor Aguilar, and then community members who wrote to Dr. Vela, who attended the College Council meeting and spoke, or who submitted comments. So it was definitely a collaborative effort, and so we wanted to just end by showing our appreciation to everyone who helped make this happen.
Thank you.
All right, thank you guys. So now we're going to turn it over to Trinidad Gonzales, who's going to give us his perspective on the monuments and everything that's happening.
Hi, can everybody hear me? I guess we're fine.
Yes.
I thank Chris and everybody else that's part of the session, for being here. I think this is an important topic. I was struck, I have some prepared notes here, but I was struck by the Rangers' response to the students' questions about, was he aware of the history of the Rangers? And he, qualified it with the F. And that's very problematic, and I want to touch base on that. So I thought it was very good that encounter comes up. This is something I want to get at. So I don't want to get into the Texas Ranger history specifically. I think that's well covered ground by this point for many people. You have to be willfully ignorant at this point to not be aware of the atrocities that the Texas Rangers engaged in. From the beginning of their founding to, through the early 20th century, and then continued acts of police violence and abuse through the rest of the 20th century. So I don't want to get into that kind of detail. What I really want to get to, and Chris asked me to talk about this because we're looking at monuments, is to understand the importance of monuments and symbols for human society. Since prehistory, humans have painted on cave walls, to provide images both for memory and for sacred purposes. They've erected rock monuments to remember places of honor or to remember their past ones who have passed that have gone on. So humans have used monuments in many ways to venerate those from the present and those from the past. And what it's really getting at is a representation of value that the society holds. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about what is the collective value we hold as a community. One thing I talk about every semester and every class that I teach in history is many students walk in like, I just got to take this class because this is credit that's necessary for me. But one of the things I talk about is that history is about power. And I try to engage in a Socratic discussion with them about what I'm trying to get at. And what essentially I'm getting at is if your community's history is not represented in, say, the official textbooks that are provided to students by the state, if it's not represented in the monuments and the other sorts of imagery that we have within our community, that is a value statement. And in this case, it's a value statement that you're so unimportant, we're not even going to include you in the history of our textbooks, much less our monuments and our statues and things like that. Now, there's also the flip side of that, the representation of minorities through a racist lens within textbooks, which has occurred, and Chris and myself and many people on this session here and around the state of Texas fought against the proposed racist textbook that occurred a few years ago here at the State Board of Education in Austin. And so there's also that, right? And so there's also imageries that either just leave silent or represent negatively a minority group or women, for instance, or people who are the LGBTQ community. And then let's talk about, say, for instance, the Confederate statutes or the Texas Ranger statutes that are out there, imageries. While there's not a specific negative depiction of, say, African Americans or Mexican Americans, the statues themselves are already imbued with meaning. So people already come with a set sort of understanding of that statue and what that statue means. And the people putting up those statues understand that meaning within the community. So when you put a Confederate statue up, when African Americans are pushing for civil rights, right, in the late 19th, early 20th, and then the mid 20th century, that's when these statues come up. When you put a Ranger statue up, you understand that history and that meaning as it's told at that time. And it's a value statement saying, we value this image because it represents, in this case, the control of minority groups for African Americans, Confederate statues for Mexican Americans and African Americans in Texas and Native Americans, the Texas Ranger. And so it's important then to understand that these monuments, these symbols come with imbued meaning as that has been taught through the history system within the state, right? Classrooms, textbooks, so on and so forth. And then you got movies, so on and so forth. But there is always a counter history within the community, right? So I am a descendant of somebody who was killed by the Texas Rangers. My great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather, his father, were killed by the Rangers in 1915 during La Matanza. And so I grew up with that history. And so, I didn't have, growing up, a positive view of the Texas Rangers. And I'm not alone in that sort of life experience, right? Los Urinches, as, Chris's book refers to. And so there's this other history. But that other history, while it's validated within our families, it's validated within our communities, it's validated within the corridos that go back over 100 years, it's validated within the literature we produce, it is not recognized by the state. And the question becomes, why is that important? Because the state is an apparatus of power that affects all of our lives. Right? And so if we really want to take a turn to a more just society, we want to take a turn to the dream of what this country is supposed to be based on, right? This country is based on an idea. We're all created equal, right? Then we need to remove those symbols that represent inequality and racism and sexism and homophobia, and then replace them with symbols that represent the values that we're trying to achieve for a more equitable and caring society, right? And that's and that takes a spectrum, right? That takes a spectrum of education, textbooks, literature, poetry, and in this case specifically, we're talking about statues, public memory. And public memory is very important because it's going to, one, affirm that communities that have been marginalized, but then also affirm by the whole community as a whole that, yeah, we understand you, right? So when that Texas Ranger statue was removed from Dallas, that was a significant moment of saying, we understand, we're at an inflection point where we need to adjust how we venerate particular images or symbols and what that means about our value system. And you see this across the United States with their taking down of Confederate monuments and statues. So it's very important. Now, there is a history by Mexicanos in the state of Texas, starting in the early 20th century, to, for instance, put forward their own images, right? Put forward to say, hey, we should be venerated, right? So Jose de la Luz Sainz, an educator, somebody who volunteered. He was too old to be drafted, but volunteered to fight in World War I. He did fight in World War I. He writes about his experiences in World War I, and it's published. It was originally published in Spanish. Now there's an English translation of it out of Texas A&M University. And he comes in, he's one of the founders of LULAC, right? But he pushed for the creation of a statue honoring the Mexicano World War I veterans, right? And he tried raising the money, but he couldn't do it. It is not until 2012 a Tejano monument is finally placed in the Capitol in Austin. Right? Think about it. We have somebody in the early 1930s who's a World War I veteran saying we need to have a monument for World War I veterans of Mexican descent who fought for this country, who defended its ideals, but who came back and then are discriminated against. We need this monument because he understood what the importance of that monument would say. If the larger community accepted that statue, then it'll say, yes, there is value to you, right? And maybe how you're being treated is incorrect, right? Not until 2012 that we get the Tejano monument. And that was controversial to begin with. I mean, there's people who say it shouldn't be put up, it should be this, it shouldn't be that. And so we do have a history of erecting images and statues right now. Those are the official ones. Those are the ones sanctioned by the state or by community government. I was fortunate enough to present with the Minister of Culture and Tourism from South Africa back in 1999 when I was at Smithsonian. And he had a really interesting conversation to an audience that helped facilitate about graffiti in South Africa under apartheid, and how graffiti was used as a way of creating public art, public imagery, to convey a political message, but a political message about the issues of an injustice, but also then a value, right? We also have that tradition of mural art in the United States, right? Where we use that, right? The difference though is in South Africa, you could get killed if you did the art, whereas in the United States, people probably deface it, right? So when we talk about the values of monuments and images, there's this constant struggle for those who've been marginalized to try to take control of public space, try to present their value to the community. And so I want to leave with this, and then I'll be open to questions. If you have more specific questions about Ranger history, then I'll talk to that. But I want to leave with this, and that we're finally at a point in time where we need to grapple with this history. And concerning the Texas Ranger who said that, oh, if that happened, and we know we have the scholarship that does say it happens, but more importantly, the state of Texas said it did happen. And the report to the 1919 investigation of the Texas Rangers by the state of Texas, the report acknowledges the atrocities and the killings against Mexicanos. It's just that they hit the report. They didn't want the public to read the report. But the state of Texas acknowledged those killings. However, the state of Texas also then said there should not be any strict restraints on the Texas Rangers' behaviors because of Mexicans, right? We're still the bad people that need to be heavily policed. And if there's not a racist rationale for policing that justifies the creation or the maintenance of the Rangers, it's done there in the documents of the state of Texas, right? And so if the state of Texas said that back in 1919, both that they did things that are wrong, but the creation of the Rangers or the maintenance of Rangers has to stay in effect because of these Mexicans represent the need for violence against them, then it's time that we start grappling with the Department of Public Safety's own accounting of its history of the Texas Rangers. Because you go to the Department of Public Safety and they talk about the Texas Rangers on their history page, they still represent Mexicans and Indians as the enemy. And that's a problem because that inculcates then the institutional identity of how you exist. That's why not knowing your past affects then how you police today. And I'll leave it with that.
Thank you, Trini. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Noreen Rivera. Go ahead, Noreen.
Okay, one moment, Chris. I'm going to go ahead and do the screen share for my PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, let me. There we go. Can you see that, everybody?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So my colleague, Chris Carmona, asked me to speak about Mexican American and Chicanx literary responses throughout history to Texas myths and monuments. And so this is the presentation that I've put together for today. And I have some prepared remarks that I'll read from. Let me start this here. So, Americo Paredes, a pillar in the formation of Chicano literary and cultural studies, who has been, in the decades after his death in 1999, both celebrated and rightfully critiqued for his 1958 book, With His Pistol in His Hand, which is on Mexican-American heteropatriarchal ranger evading border hero Gregorio Cortes, stated in this same book, quote, had the Alamo, Goliad, and Mier not existed, they would have been invented. And indeed, they seem to have been, in part. Paredes, like John Steinbeck, understood that Texas is an ideology. In fact, Steinbeck's memoir, Travels with Charlie in Search of America, Steinbeck writes in this work, quote, I have said that Texas is a state of mind, but I think it is more than that. It is a mystique, closely approximating a religion. And this is true to the extent that people either passionately love Texas or passionately hate it. And as in other religions, few people dare to inspect it for fear of losing their bearings in mystery or paradox. While Paredes may have been the first and maybe only mid-20th century author of Mexican descent to receive death threats by sons of retired Texas Rangers because his book on Cortes dismantles the once ironclad mythos surrounding these Texas icons of flesh and stone, the critical inspection of Texas mythical figures and monuments rooted in the perpetuation of white supremacy is a topic that Chicanx writers have addressed since the last battle of the Texas Revolution. And it is one that continues into the present, as we've seen from our previous presenters. However, in response to Steinbeck's duality of passionately loving or hating Texas, I want to emphasize that for Chicanx writers and our allies, it is an inspection not rooted in a hate for Texas. Like myself and like my colleagues on this panel, Chicanx writers have historically addressed visual and written forms of racism for the sake of establishing a more perfect union, and for the sake of bettering Texas to follow another ideology, that of democracy for all. With this, let me give you an overview of some of the works written by authors of Mexican descent who have dared to inspect dominant Texas monuments and myths in their writing. Juan Seguin is one of the earliest, if not the first, to contend with the Alamo myth and that of the Texas Revolution. His memoirs, originally titled The Personal Memoirs of Juan N. Seguin, were printed in 1858 and have since been edited by Jesus F. de la Teja in the critical edition, A Revolution Remembered, the memoirs and selected correspondence of Juan N. Seguin. Seguin, a political leader, an ally of Stephen F. Austin, and a military captain who led a unit at Tejanos to fight against Santa Anna's centrist Mexican forces, disrupts the imagined brown and white color lines of the Texas Revolution in his memoirs. He tends to his legacy that he knows will suffer from historical erasure, since the mythos of Texas Revolution history cemented righteous white Texan defenders against Santa Anna's swarthy Mexican army. Seguin's memoirs record his disenfranchisement and betrayal by white Texans in the years following the Texas Revolution of 1835 to 1836, when he was removed from his position as mayor of San Antonio under false pretenses of treason, and vigilante authorities drove him to exile in Mexico. Credited for the canonical line as being, quote, a foreigner in his own land, Seguin writes in his memoirs, quote, a victim to the wickedness of a few men, a foreigner in my native land, could I be expected to stoically endure their outrages and insults? I sought for shelter amongst those against whom I fought. I separated from my country, my parents, family, relatives, and friends, and what was more, from the institutions on behalf which I had drawn my sword, with an earnest wish to see Texas free and happy. An equestrian statue of Seguin has been erected in Seguin, Texas, the town that bears his name, as of 2000. Maybe this is a step forward. Another noteworthy writer is Adina de Zavala, the granddaughter of Lorenzo de Zavala, the first vice president of Texas. Adina published History and Legends of the Alamo in 1917. This work, which has been critically recovered and edited by Richard R. Flores in 1996, is a multi-genre medley of legends that narrate the Spanish colonial and Catholic presence of San Antonio, and also includes historical essays. As Flores discusses in the introduction to the critical edition of History and Legends of the Alamo, and in his book, Remembering the Alamo, Memory, Modernity, and the Master Symbol, Adina de Zavala was involved in a heated political battle involving which buildings of the Alamo battle site to preserve. Her nemesis was Clara Driscoll, daughter of South Texas ranching, banking, and commercial capitalist Robert Driscoll. While Adina de Zavala aimed to preserve the Alamo site as both a Spanish mission and a battle site, Driscoll did not appreciate attaching any structures other than the iconic edifice that has represented the Alamo mission for over the last century. De Zavala wished to preserve the long two-story barracks that were once part of the Spanish mission's convento complex, and where she argued most of the fighting of the Battle of the Alamo had occurred. Driscoll saw this structure, as illustrated on the right here, as aesthetically unpleasing, as unsightly, and ultimately Driscoll had her way, and with some political pull, had the upper level of the convent walls demolished. Adina de Zavala's History and Legends of the Alamo is a written attempt to restructure the destruction of Spanish Catholic colonial structures, as well as to expand the historicity of the Alamo space as more than a site of the Texas Revolution located downtown. In my view, because her legends in this text include narratives devoted to the other four missions of San Antonio, such as Mission San Juan de Capistrano, Mission Concepcion, Mission San Francisco de Espada, as well as Mission San Jose. Her book is invested in recentering and even respacing the history of San Antonio to be more than a monologic site of the Alamo mythos, because it is one that includes the surrounding Spanish missions. Speed up to recent public projects in the San Antonio cityscape, I believe that while Adina de Zavala lost the battle of preserving the two-story convent to Clara Driscoll, she would be pleased, if she was around today, to see the 2015 completion of the hike and bike trail that leads goers to the historical and legendary spaces, as well as other monuments of San Antonio that she covers in her book. Moving on, the 1930s was a critical decade for Mexican-American writers' literary responses to Texas myths and monuments because of the Texas Centennial in 1936. Best documented by John M. Gonzales in his work Border Renaissance, the Texas Centennial and the Emergence of Mexican-American Literature, Gonzales addresses the troubling links between the myths of racial superiority historically tying Nazi and Anglo-Texan supremacy, along with other discursive historical and literary violence existing in Texas through to 1936 Centennial, which ignited a vibrant literary response from Mexican-American authors such as Jovito González, Américo Paredes, in his earlier novel, George Washington Gomez, as well as Elena Zamora O'Shea, to name a few from his study. Zamora, O'Shea, González, and Paredes are each invested in their separate efforts to provide a counter history to Texas. O'Shea's El Mezquite, for example, tells of South Texas history from pre-European colonial times to the 20th century through the eyes of a mesquite tree, which embodies a Spanish Tejano perspective of historical events in South Texas. González, in her work, Life Along the Border, which is her 1930 master's thesis, since recovered by Chicana scholar Maria Cotera, contends with Anglo-Texan historians' depictions of Texas border history nearly a quarter century prior to Américo Paredes with his pistol in his hand. Likewise, her co-authored novel, Caballero, written in the years after the Centennial, aimed to provide a Spanish-Mexican landed elite perspective of life, loss, and cultural adaptation during the era of the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. Paredes' magistral and culturally complex novel, George Washington Gomez, which was written while he was in his 20s and is set from 1914 and covers through to the early rumblings of World War II in the South Texas borderlands, is a coming-of-age story centering on Walinto, aka George Washington Gomez. Paredes strikes hard at the Alamo mythos in this novel. When Walinto is of school age, Paredes presents a counter-narrative to Texas public school curriculums of the early 20th century that continue to this day. While his teacher in the novel tells the story of the Texan founding fathers and heroes of the revolution, Walinto and his friends, conscious of an alternative history told at home by their families, swear under their breath with a child's animosity, "We're proud of our forefathers who killed gringos at the Alamo." Additionally, Paredes sets his sights on the Texas Rangers in this novel from its opening movement that renders the father of the title or character killed by a group of murdering Rinches, acting on the mentality that the only good Mexican in South Texas is a dead one. The novel, like Postcards and other images that we've seen thus far, does not shy away from the racial and cultural violence of the South Texas borderlands. As always, one cannot heal unless one is able to name one hurt, and one cannot heal unless one is heard. As my time is short, for your knowledge, I'm going to go ahead and start listing some novels by Chicanx writers who continue in the last half of the century, from 1950 up until this 2020, that further this conversation, which I've started. So we have Rolando Hinojosa, pictured to your right here. His Clay City Death Trip series is a brilliant outpouring of vignettes that splice South Texas border violence of the past with the narrator's present circumstances as a US soldier fighting in the trenches of the Korean War. Moving into the late 1990s, we have Sandra Cisneros' short story collection, Woman Hollering Creek, that beautifully recalibrates the patriarchal Texan Alamo mythos by illustrating the perspective of life, loss, and resilience of Chicana protagonists varying in ages living in and around the San Antonio region. Chicana academics and novelists such as Alicia Gaspar de Alba and Emma Perez, publishing in the early 21st century, add a new and complex gender and sexuality dynamic to the perspectives of Chicanx characters navigating through plots that complicate and critique dominant Texas narratives. Gaspar de Alba's Desert Blood, The Juarez Murderers, is a murder mystery that narrates the complicity of corrupt Border Patrol agents who aid and profit in the murders of Maquila female workers, while the protagonist, Chicana lesbian Yvonne, races against time with the help of honorable law enforcement officers and clergy members to find her missing sister. Emma Perez, Forgetting the Alamo or Blood Memory, is a historical revisionist novel that follows the life of a Chicana lesbian landed cowgirl after the fall of the Alamo. Based on the gendered and sexual dynamics that I've mentioned, this should clearly signal that this is not your baby pocket. Lastly, there has been yet another flourishing, perhaps because we came upon another centennial year recently in the way of the 100th anniversary of the 1915 Matanza, seditionist period, border violence that disrupted the lives of many people of Mexican descent in South Texas. Novels like Guadalupe Garcia Mical's Shame the Stars, published in 2016, Balo's War, a novel about the Plan of Santiago, published in 2015, as well as for Carmona's superhero fiction novel, Ranger of the Rio Grande, and recent works by historians such as Benjamin H. Johnson, Monica Martinez, as well as a forthcoming anthology of essays titled Reverberations of Racial Violence, Critical Reflections on Borderlands History, edited by Sonia Hernandez and John M. Gonzalez, which is a collection where some of my colleagues and I on this panel have essays, or in my case, a work of poetry that's based on my family's historical encounters with the Texas Rangers back in the 1920s, all continue to further the arc of Chicanx and Mexican-American literary responses to dominant Texas myths and monuments. We continue to interrogate myths and monuments and name our ethnic pain for the hope of a more perfect union. Thank you.
Thank you, Noreen. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Marci.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen first. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes.
All right, images that we've seen before, right? So I wanted to add, my colleagues on this panel have presented the kind of work that we've been seeing happen throughout this country for centuries, right? And so what I want to add is, you know, I want to amplify the thread, right, that the work by Chicanx and Latinx activists and artists to dismantle white supremacy through the taking down of monuments, mascots, and the creation of plaques and monuments to counter these racist colonial histories. This is deep historical work, right? And this is evident by the fact that just about a month ago, San Antonio College was successful in finally getting the college to take down the Ranger mascot. Dr. Gonzales talked about the work of the Refusing to Forget Project and his own personal history as descendants of families that have been violently impacted by the Texas Rangers. And then Dr. Rivera is talking about the kind of long, you know, Chicanx, Latinx cultural production, right, that's been working to counter these histories. So what I thought I would do is just take us back to 3 years ago, from just a couple days ago. It was only 3 years ago that the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally took place in Charlottesville, Virginia. And I had just happened to be that summer in another place in Virginia, Richmond, Virginia, with a colleague of mine writing about a production of a Latinx theater production of In the Heights that had been taking place in her community, and we were writing about it. And so I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. I've lived in the Rio Grande Valley for the last 12 years. I haven't spent a lot of time in the capital of the Confederacy. So it was a really unique space to be in at that time when all of this kind of movement to take down monuments was happening that summer, a lot like what we're seeing right now. So 3 years ago seems like ages ago, but I'm going to take us to a journey of just sort of some commentary of what I've witnessed with that, in a way that just to offer that how we can continue to find inspiration in this, but also address a question of how we continue to sustain this work for the long term, because this is work that continues in everyone on this panel and those who are listening in have been part of these movements. And so it's sort of a thought for me is how do we sustain this work? But let's go through this history. So just 3 summers ago, August 11th to the 12th, to be exact, we recall that the Unite the Right rally, where we heard the militant shrill of white nationalists, neo-Confederates, and neo-Nazis carrying tiki torches violently invaded the University of Virginia campus. Back then, we were all glued to our television and computer screens witnessing this moment, a lot like we are now today with the protests happening, the Black Lives Matter protests and the taking down of monuments that have been happening the last month. This rally, the Unite the Right rally, was reminiscent of something just out of a KKK march that many in the nation hadn't even seen. Not that they hadn't seen racism or witnessed racism, but this kind of blatant, brazenly out in public racism that was then loudly endorsed by President Trump. Yet outside the campus, counter to these chants, and this is a theme that runs throughout this, is always counter to this, right, are these counter protests. So right outside the campus, we heard Black, Indigenous, people of color activists and counter protests, and those protests grew over 2 days. And we saw the violence that took place with one protester killed. And even at that time, one protester killed death outraged us as a nation. And we're seeing just numerous deaths and violence taking place in the streets today with the Black Lives Matter protests, particularly thinking about Portland, Oregon, and what's continuing there. On that same day of the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally in summer 2017, seems like ages ago, it was only 3 years ago, I was driving in my car listening to the now defunct, or we might say defunded, no longer exists, local NPR station. And on that program, I heard activist Andy Diaz proclaim, quote, I'm proud to be Mexican American, Chicano, Latino, and we've got to defend our land here in the border, our culture, our tradition. We cannot let Donald Trump and this administration divide us, end quote. Speaking at a South Texas rally whose call is to save the mission, save the river, resist the wall. Those were the signs that you saw at the march, and I have the image of the march up on the screen. The activist Diaz claims the legacy of Chicanx history in the Rio Grande Valley. Over 500 protesters that day demanded protection of La Lomita, the historic chapel that would be divided by Trump's border wall, which today is still in a court dispute, a court battle dispute that hasn't been settled. And that's another example of a counter protest. In this case, in the land shaped by the violent, racist, and colonial history between the United States and Mexico. So we're moving from the capital of the Confederacy in Virginia to the place we've been speaking about throughout this panel, the Valley, the borderlands. 2 days later, after the Charlottesville rally and the RGV border wall protest, in Durham, North Carolina, a historic site of major battles over racial segregation in the home of the KKK, I see and hear activists chanting on my Facebook newsfeed, quote, we are the revolution and no Trump, no KK, no fascist USA. What we all see next on our computer screens is an act of bravery. A Black woman climbs to the top of the statue, wraps the Confederate soldier's head with a yellow rope, and as a protester below pulls the rope, the monument topples with little effort. Down below, we hear activists cursing the monument, giving it the finger, spitting on it, and kicking its face. By lynching the white supremacist Confederate statue, the Durham protesters create space for equity and inclusivity. And this is what Dr. Gonzales was talking about at the beginning of the panel about the importance of histories being represented and what monuments symbolize. So taking that down created space for other histories to be heard and visible in the city. And if you haven't seen the video of that moment, if you don't remember the news at that time, if you haven't seen it, it's worthwhile looking it up. I was going to play it, but I didn't want it to delay on the presentation. So in that same summer of 2017, another counter protest in Richmond, Virginia, which is the capital of the Confederacy, at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, the bilingual Spanish and English exhibition, I have these mixed up. The bilingual and English, Spanish and English exhibition, Nuestras Historias Latinos in Richmond, opens. The exhibition features oral histories and photographs that capture the voices of Latinx people and experiences in the city. Proclaiming these individuals' journeys, dreams, and experiences, we hear testimonials throughout the exhibit, and you also hear there's photographs of community members. And this was a significant exhibit in Richmond because the Latinx population in Richmond is a growing community. And within this Confederate space, this Black and white history, their voices aren't often heard. Down the street from that exhibit, going backwards, city leaders, we pull back the tarps covering the statue of African-American entrepreneur and civil rights advocate Maggie Walker. The 10-foot bronze statue stands triumphant in Jackson Ward, or Black Wall Street, an area that serves as a dividing line between Black and white communities in Richmond, Virginia. As the crowd counts 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, the roar and applause grows. After the statue is unveiled, family members share the historic figure's well-known words of resilience. Unite, quote, unite head, heart, and hand. Be strong in words. Stand firm in what is right. Have faith, have hope, have courage, and carry on, end quote. These celebratory sounds of Black community members inspire, just like these other counter protests, they inspire and reimagine resilience, refusal, and reparation, and a space where Black people and people of color weren't always welcome. So my colleagues today have already shared the abundance of activist and artistic efforts by Chicanx communities in the Rio Grande Valley. We could add to that contemporary efforts at UTRGV with the Vaquero mascot and sort of the controversies around the Vaquero and Vaquera and the conversation taking place about that. There's an abundance of artistic cultural production in the Valley today, from news media. There's the news programming Neta, right? You know, kind of seeing those along the Chicanx literary production that Dr. Rivera spoke about. We can all kind of look at that as counter-protest to these white supremacist monuments. So as we've been all glued in the recent months to our screens, watching the counter-protests, I know I don't know about you, but I've been personally rattled by the violence, and I know that we all have, but it doesn't seem, but there's a history here, right? And so it continues. This is not new, right? And so I think that one thing that we can do is this panel today that we've provided is sort of a historical context to what's been happening in the nation, but also like what's specifically happening in Texas. So I just leave with that. The final thought that I want to say is just a question about the continued efforts to sustain this work. I'm always just thinking about that. How do we sustain this activist work? And I think Nati and Diana provided a great model for how that was a grassroots effort, and how it was so important to get the institution to support their efforts to make that happen. So I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Marci. So what I'm going to go ahead and do now is, if for the audience members who are there, if you guys want to go ahead and start typing in your questions, I'm going to go ahead and ask the panel here a few questions of my own, just to kind of say that recently, I think a little over a month ago, there was a Confederates monument to Jefferson Davis in Brownsville, in Washington Park. And after 3 years of trying to get that monument removed, we were finally able to do that. And pretty much around the same time as the Ranger mascot, they got the win for the Ranger mascots. So you know, that was another victory that happened with the removal of that monument there in Brownsville. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Nati and Diana this question. So you guys have been in this fight for 2 years, and one of the questions I really want to ask you guys about is, what was the student response to your efforts, and how do you think this represents, you know, the learning of history in this country?
So you saw the 41% that voted to keep the Ranger, right? So these were largely students, and it really shows how, if we had had the supportive administration, we would have reached a large part of those 41%. Anytime that we shared our zine or we lectured in a class, or like, we had no idea that the Rangers had this history, and that we were even associated with the Rangers, with the mascot. And it just really shows how K-12 does not teach this history. And you wait till college to really find out what was going on in Texas and your own Chicano history. You have to wait till you're in college. And, you know, we do the work of K-12, but when we reached out to the students, they had no idea that the Rangers, unless they were taking MAS, unless they had taken an ethnic studies class, they had no idea. And that really showed in that 41%. To think, I thought it was going to be close to 80% where the students wanted to remove it, but 41 to 59 is too close for comfort to me. I was surprised, but it really just shows how much more work that we have to do, how we have to continue getting MAS classes out there in the K-12 and in college, having more ethnic studies. Just the fight continues on, and the student response since then has been great. Anytime that we go and lecture, they're like, yes, you know, I feel empowered by learning my history. I just didn't know.
Thank you. So Nati, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I'll just add, you know, even the MAS department, where a lot of us are finally learning about, you know, our history, that we didn't get to learn before this. I mean, the Moss department at SAC started in 2000, was it 16, Diana?
16.
So it's just a few years old. And so there's so many people that have passed through SAC that, you know, have been, you know, associated with the Ranger, and just were not given the opportunity to learn this history there. I always tell Diana, like, man, I'm glad I waited so long to go to college, because my experience would have been so different without Moss, you know. So yeah, definitely we need more Moss programs, more ethnic studies programs, to get people educated on their histories, for sure.
Thank you, guys. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of open up a question to kind of everybody here. So when we look at the future of representation, especially when we're dealing with images of public history such as mascots and monuments, and you know, we didn't really get to discuss the postcards, but postcards have always been a huge part of this type of racist rhetoric, because these postcards were sold for many years of these lynchings, of these of very violent actions against people of color. Specifically in South Texas, you had Mexicans being lynched, and they were sold. I remember all the way up until, I would think, in the 90s, they were being sold in most museums, and so, you know, when we start to look at that kind of representation, you know, what efforts do you guys think would help to better challenge these, or to create you know, different types of public historical artifacts? And, you know, like, to kind of, because what, you know, what a lot of these monuments and stuff we're looking at came about because of the Daughters of the Confederacy trying to really regain the history or the myth of the South, right? And now we're in a time where we're trying to really tear a lot of that down. So my question is to everybody, I guess, you know, how do you guys envision challenging or changing these images or this history? So I'm throwing it open to anybody.
Well, I think in today's, you know, sort of use of political imagery, we're talking about memes, right? So memes have become cards, although they're not being sold, excuse me. They're being utilized for political commentary. So it's difficult when you have a system such as social media and the use of memes to spread disinformation or racist and sexist and homophobic messages. How do we tackle that? It's always going to be through education, particularly education through development of values within both our educational institutions, but within our larger civil society outside of those institutions. And I think that gets to the larger point of the monuments that we're talking about as well. And the means will have less resonance if there's a greater understanding or promotion of values that reject those means.
I think it's interesting too, what we've been seeing just recently with the Redskins mascot, right? It took, there's something about, you know, the education's important and these fights are important, but once corporate power and money gets involved, right? That's such a strong, loud, powerful force, right? That can be very frustrating, right, to those of us who've been doing this work. And it's like, it just takes a company saying they're upset at the mascot, right? But there's something about that we're seeing. It's a sort of a critical consciousness that's needed, right? And the education's important. The memes are important. You know, I think we're at a time that's interesting where people are actually paying attention in ways that they haven't before. The fact that Aunt Jemima, right, is finally, Uncle Ben's and all of those racist products are finally being taken away. So I kind of think on the one hand, I have some hope about our current moment, but, you know, very cynical at the same time. But money is power. You know, get some loud, powerful voices to be against, you know,
so
policy.
We do have a question here from John. I guess it's to everyone in particular. John writes, dark tourism is a topic brought to my attention lately. Do monuments, mascots, and postcards contribute to dark tourism? If so, how? And how do we combat this while maintaining historical integrity? So that's interesting. Dark tourism is one of those things. Like, I think that I was watching Whoopi Goldberg talk about how she has a racist collection of of dolls and different things that she's been collecting for years. And that's kind of that whole thing. Like, but she's collecting it for a different reason, I think, than maybe other people might do when we talk about dark tourism. So I don't know if anybody wants to kind of tackle that question.
Well, I think we have a strange fascination with horrible events, morbid curiosity to see where these events take place. One of the dark tourism episodes was or dark tourism is serial killers and where they committed the crimes. And I was watching something on Jeffrey Dahmer. So there are tours that people pay money to go on these tours and go see the places where he lived and it's very morbid. It's very morbid. But in a historical context, going to see this different, like if it was us going to visit Porvenir, or different, like the tree in Goliad that Nati wrote the poem on, or different places. I don't know if it's I don't know if that would be considered dark tourism, but I yes, because if violent events took place in those places, so us going there, while it might be spiritual to us, we connect with because it is part of our history. I think it also contributes to that type of tourism. But I mean, I don't know. As long as we're interested in history, I think that these are things that we're gonna have to grapple with. Yeah.
Well, I'll respond
one
to
of the
that
things
next because
go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Chris. So my understanding of dark tourism is they're historical sites of death and tragedy. So you immediately think about the concentration camps, Nazi concentration camps like Auschwitz. You can think about the Ground Zero, September 11th. You can even think about in terms of our local response to the Matanza when we worked together to dedicate the marker out on Highway 77 there. So those could be examples of dark tourism, but ones in which help spotlight past violences for the sake of cultural learning and national learning, and they can be used as an asset in terms of spotlighting hallowed ground where atrocities happened, where death happened, where genocide happened, and we can move forward together wiser and create better community bonds thereafter.
What I was gonna say, go ahead, Nati.
I was gonna say also making sure that we humanize, the victims of these incidents. Like, for example, when we made our zine to pass out on campus, we did use, a graphic, image that was on a postcard of Ranger violence, but we and you can see our zine in the link we shared, but we edited it to try to make it more respectful and not exploitative, and because we thought it was important to humanize these people that were actually actual people with families and stories, and so we made sure that we added their names. We felt it was important for people to see this. It's a very impactful image and it impacted us, and so we wanted other people to see it, but we wanted to do it in a way that was respectful of the victim. So we kind of faded it out a little bit, and then we put, we made sure that we had all their names.
That's good. Thank you. So yeah, I think that that is an important question, and kind of to reference the Texas Ranger statue that was up at the Dallas Fort Worth left field. I had heard that they had actually removed it back in the 80s for the same type of criticism, and then they quietly put it back up. So just to like when we think about like where we're going with this, and then like, you know, we have to also maintain vigilance, you know, because we're in a moment now where people are paying attention. But if we stop, you know, paying attention to these things, then are these things going to slip back into, you know, just to be, because there's still a lot of people who support this type of history, right? Who and so that is one question that I was thinking, like, how do we, you know, it seems like right now we're at a turning point historically for challenging these statues. But when these statues first started going up, you know, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a long, you know, criticism of these statues going up, and that was back in the 1920s. And yet, you know, here we are, basically 100 years later, still fighting for to remove this history. So I think that, you know, when we start to look at this, I want to go ahead and ask a question toward Noreen here, unless we get another one in the box. So given the, you know, the negative portrayal of Mexicans in literature, how is it important to challenge the dominant narratives of Mexicans and in Texas in literature? And, you know, how important is it to have a response by writers of color?
Can you hear me, Chris, and everyone?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. My connection got a bit spotty, so I didn't catch the latter half of the question. But from what I understood, you're asking about how important is it for there to be that that response
Yes.
to. Yeah, I mean, of course, it's incredibly important. that's what inspires the work done by everyone on this panel, and perhaps a number of people listening or who will listen on YouTube in the future when this goes up. You have to continually create a dialogue, otherwise we slip into, well, like John's, the photo from John's Border Renaissance shows, we slip into fascism and ethno-nationalism, and we can't have that. This country was founded on the ideals of democracy, and so it's my belief that at the core of all allies and advocates of democracy for all races and sexes and genders and so forth, we have to keep pressing the fight, because that's what makes this country, you know, it makes it beautiful and does, I don't want to say it makes it exceptional, but it does distinguish us in that we continue to have these desires and these, I guess you can say, this continued activism for being, as I said in my talk, a more perfect union.
Thank you, Noreen. So I just want to go, just have two more questions. One's for Trini. I want to see if we could talk about the work of Refusing to Forget, and how the project itself has kind of taken on a life of its own. As I understand it, you weren't expecting it to have such a long-lasting life as it has. But if you wanted to go ahead and talk about you guys' work.
Okay, well, just to I guess we could finally publicly announce that Chris is now a board member of Refusing to Forget. So everyone out there, you know, give Chris, you know, us actually Refusing to Forget. He's going to really come in and fill a gap that we have for our board. But when we started talking in 2013, our main concern obviously was bringing to a public audience the scholarship that was already out there, you know, since the 60s and 70s and the 80s and the 90s, including the scholarship that Ben had done, I had done, Monica was working on, you know, Sonia and John, bringing the scholarship that we had all published or presented on to a general audience, to a public audience, right? So, you know, scholars in academia, we tend to get caught up in our own loops and our own world, and we forget that there's a larger world out there that could use the information that we've produced as scholars, as intellectuals. And so we took on a public history role, public intellectual role, which none of us, maybe with the exception of me, because I used to be in reporting and I used to be an editor and I wrote columns and stuff like that. You know, we weren't trained as public historians. And so we listed some projects that we wanted to get accomplished. an exhibit, which ended up happening. The markers are very important because as this session is talking about, we're talking about monuments, right? So the historical markers were the first time that the state of Texas was going to officially acknowledge by physically placing a marker that's going to be there for, the rest of our lives, to be placed to remember these histories and these events that are not told in textbooks, that are not told publicly, other than by those of us who advocate for its public presentation. And then we're going to create a webpage as a resource for the larger community to learn about this history, to be able to use that history, biographies, and then a social media platform to talk about the events we're doing, and as well as responding to questions or queries. We get a lot of questions from people. A couple of weeks ago, an individual who's a descendant of persons who were killed had a document from his great-grandmother where she notarized witnessing the killing of her family members, right? That we hadn't come across before, right? So people are reaching out to us still. And so we originally thought we're gonna, my daughter wants to be on camera. We originally thought we're, do the markers, the exhibit, the website, and a couple of other things. For instance, we weren't planning to do a book, but that came along. The book came along, so that's something that fell in our lap. And the conference on Canales we weren't planning to do that, but that came along as well, and that led to the book as we know it. And so we just realized that Refusing to Forget, that we plan to disband in about 5 or 6 years, past 2015, we can't. It has become an institution within our community, and people look to us on how to address this history, how to then publicly advocate against those people who want to distort this history. And I haven't even listed the advocacy we engaged in, because there's a lot of advocacy in that is sometimes behind the scenes. It's not publicly known. And we got to make, call legislators and stuff like that. And so we're going to continue the project, and we're thinking through currently how that's going to move forward, right? And one of the things we decided is that we needed to bring some more individuals onto the board. In this case, we brought in Chris to fill gaps within our expertise, right? All 5 of us have different sorts of expertise in doing the kind of public history and public work we do. So RTF's not going away, and it's going to be institutionalized, hopefully beyond the 6 of us, and continue going on for the next 10, 20 years. But we're trying to bring in new perspective and ideas to continue to work through the project, because there's so much more history that needs to be done, so much more advocacy that needs to be done, particularly related to monuments and exhibits and continuing spreading of this information.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. I want to thank everybody who is taking part in this discussion. Thank the questions we've gotten. Yeah, I think that this is a conversation that is going to be ongoing for a while because of the time we're in. But yes, and we're planning to do more of these different talks over the next few months. This will be up on YouTube probably tomorrow. And so we will be sharing it all over the place. But I think that everybody here has done great work. And, I think that, what the work that Nati and Diana have done is exceptional. I mean, it took us a long time to get the Confederate monument removed, and you guys did it in 2 years. And I think a lot of that has to do with the work that you guys have been doing. And as students, that's a tough line. So I want to go ahead and congratulate them on their win, and everybody who's been working on doing this. And thank you all for joining us tonight. And y'all have a good night. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Chris. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.
How was that? Unmute yourself.
I want to stay and hang out.
I know, I have nothing better to do. Now I'm just like, Hey,
What
Greg.
are you doing? What's up?
So who's going to buy one of my wreaths? I'm just.
Yeah.
During this entire time, I was organizing all the flowers and stuff, and I quickly had to disconnect the glue gun because it was over here. I could smell something like plastic. I was like, "What the hell is?" It wasn't like large, but like the smell of